Chicago Bulls fans got something that felt almost impossible, an actual change. Shams Charania broke the news first, and shortly after that, the Bulls made it official. Arturas Karnisovas was fired from his role as Executive Vice President of Basketball Operations. Marc Eversley was fired as General Manager, and one of the most frustrating front office eras in modern Bulls history finally came to an end. Chicago's ownership didn't even try to hide the disappointment. Michael Reinsdorf admitted the team had not delivered the success the fans deserve, and said it was his responsibility to take the franchise in a new direction. That is corporate language, for one simple truth: this thing had failed, and everyone knew it. And let's be honest right away, this was not some shocking overreaction, this was delayed, maybe even badly delayed. Under Karnisovas, the Bulls went 224 wins and 254 losses. They had only one winning season, they made the playoffs only once, and that ended in a 5-game first-round loss to Milwaukee in 2022. After that, the franchise basically lived in the worst place an NBA team can live. Not good enough to matter, not bad enough to fully rebuild. Just stuck in that dead zone between the play-in and the lottery. There was a growing disconnect inside the organization, and people across the franchise no longer seemed to know the plan, the process, or the direction. That is devastating, because once your own managers stop believing in the vision, the front office is done. Now, to be fair, this front office did make some good moves. Hiring Billy Donovan instead of keeping Jim Boylen was one of them. Signing Alex Caruso was another. Drafting Ayo Dosunmu at number 38 was a real win. And Matas Buzelis at number 11 in 2024 still looks like one of the few genuinely hopeful pieces left behind. And there is one more point that matters if we want to be fair. The original 2021 plan did make sense at first. After adding Lonzo Ball, DeMar DeRozan and Caruso, the Bulls were 38 and 21 before the All-Star break in 2021-22 season. And they were sitting near the top of the East before Lonzo's injury blew the whole thing up. That early version of the team had speed, defense, identity, and momentum. So no, this front office did not build a disaster from day one. The real failure was what happened next. They watched the formula break and still refused to pivot when it was obvious the window had slammed shut. Because the biggest problem with this front office was never just that it made mistakes. Every front office makes mistakes. The real problem was that Chicago kept doubling down on mistakes, defending mistakes, and then cleaning them up way too late for pennies on the dollar. The Bulls waited too long to trade players, misread the value of their own roster, and stacked up transactions that baffled people around the league. That is the legacy. Not bold, not smart, not patient, just mediocre and confused. And the move that sits at the center of all of it is still the Nikola Vucevic trade. Inside the organization, the trade came to be seen as the Bulls' original sin. And that is exactly what it became. Chicago gave up Wendell Carter Jr., Otto Porter Jr., and 2 first-round picks for Vucevic. Karnisovas himself later showed regret, admitting that a trade like that should have been the final move toward contention, not one of the first. And here is the killer detail. One of those first-rounders became Franz Wagner. So the Bulls didn't just overpay for Vucevic, they handed Orlando a future star while trying to skip steps in a rebuild they had barely even started. That is not aggressive team building, that is impatience dressed up as ambition. Then you get to Patrick Williams, and this is where Bulls fans really lose patience. The problem was not just the 5-year $90 million extension. The problem started the second they drafted him 4th overall in 2020. That decision did not work, and the extension became another example of the Bulls misjudging the value of their own players. But even beyond that, look at the draft board. Chicago took Williams at 4. Later in that same draft came Deni Avdija at 9, Devin Vassell at 11, Tyrese Haliburton at 12, Tyrese Maxey at 21, Emmanuel Quickly at 25 and Peyton Pritchard at 26. You can argue over order, but the big point is obvious. The Bulls swung big on upside, got almost no real star growth out of it, and then doubled down with a huge extension anyway. They didn't just miss once, they made them miss part of the payroll. And then comes the Caruso for Giddey trade, one of those moves that made fans stare at their phones and ask whether the Bulls were trolling on purpose. Maybe Josh Giddey still becomes a useful player, but the issue is the price and the context. Alex Caruso was exactly the kind of winning player every serious team wants in May and June. Oklahoma City got him, and not long after that, the Thunder won the 2025 championship. During that run, Caruso's defense was a real weapon. In Game 7 against Denver, his pressure made Nikola Jokic look uncomfortable and helped turn the series. So Bulls fans watched Chicago trade away a proven playoff killer, then watched that same guy become a major piece on a title team. That is brutal optics, and even worse asset management. The Lonzo Ball chapter is where this front office deserves a little bit of mercy. Because when that team was healthy, it worked. You remember me saying that they were at the top of Eastern Conference. And for a stretch they looked like a even real Eastern Conference contender. Lonzo's injury changed everything, and the front office got trapped by its own early success. That part is true, but defense ends there. Because once it became obvious Ball was not coming back in time to save that core, they still clung to it for too long. The Bulls kept the team together for 2 full seasons without Ball ever appearing in a game, and they clearly took too long to pick a lane. So yes, the original idea had logic, but the refusal to pivot became delusion. And when they finally did pivot, the returns were embarrassing. DeMar DeRozan left in sign and trade that brought Chicago Chris Duarte and 2 second-round picks. That is it. For one of the best and most important Bulls of the post-Jimmy Butler era, the return was basically loose change. Zach LaVine's exit at least brought back Trey Jones, Kevin Huerter, Zach Collins, and most importantly Chicago's own 2025 first-round pick, which later turned into Noah Asenge. So yes, that was better than the DeRozan return, but even there the result is still shaky. Asenge's first season was derailed almost immediately, and the idea that this was some franchise-changing asset package already looks very weak. Ayo Dosunmu is another perfect example of why Bulls fans are exhausted. Drafting him at 38 was one of this front office's best moves, but then they traded him to Minnesota for Rob Dillingham, Leonard Miller, and 4 second-round picks. On paper, that sounds like volume. In reality, it screams uncertainty. Dillingham and Miller are still long-term bets, not proven answers, and second-round picks are the NBA's favorite way to make a trade package look bigger than it really is. So the Bulls basically took one of the few genuine draft wins of this era and flipped him into another bag of maybe. That has been the whole Karnisovas story, turning certainty into fog. And Bulls fans will never forget the Lauri Markkanen disaster either. Chicago sent Markkanen out in a 3-team sign and trade and got Derrick Jones Jr., a lottery-protected first-rounder from Portland, and a protected 2023 second-round pick. That is the official framework of the deal, but emotionally and frankly reputationally, it still feels laughable when you compare what Markkanen became to what Chicago actually built. A franchise that struggled for scoring punch and frontcourt talent spent years watching a former young piece blossom elsewhere, while the Bulls kept pretending the middle of the standings was some kind of strategy. And then there is the comedy of the final act. At the 2026 trade deadline, the Bulls made a string of moves that had people online joking that the front office had decided to collect every guard available on the market. The deadline left people inside the organization confused about the team's direction. And that confusion matters because it explains why this was not just about losing games. It was about losing credibility. By the end, the Bulls had a credibility problem around the league and with their own fans. Once a front office reaches that point, every move looks suspicious, every explanation sounds hollow, and every deadline becomes a meme. So what is the final verdict of this era in Chicago? It was not the worst front office in NBA history. That would almost be too dramatic. The truth is actually more insulting. This was the front office of permanent half measures. Good enough to give Bulls fans hope, and indecisive enough to waste that hope year after year. They found Caruso, Dosunmu, and Vucevic. They hired Donovan. They built one really fun team for a few months, but then they chased the wrong timeline with Vucevic, misfired on Patrick Williams, held on to the old core too long, and sold off valuable players for returns that never matched the hype. This era was not one giant explosion, it was a death by 1,000 mediocre decisions. And in Chicago, that may be the most unforgivable thing of all.